morning, everybody. Hey, Jordan, nice to see you. Thanks for getting up for our session here on presidential elections. Mr. Rove, our friend, will be here momentarily, so when you see him slip in, we're going to chastise him later for being late.
Maybe you could actually give him a standing ovation when he arrives.
See, he's the one who seems nice is the one with the knife out. But we were at an odd choice of just picking an election we wanted to talk about, at least to get started. And we both, yeah. Oh, look who showed up. He's still, look, genius. He stole the thunder from the event already.
Yeah.
But he lost the opening monologue. So Bill chose the 1940 election, and we'll let him tell why.
And we should probably tell Karl that we decided to apportion out the time. So I get 22 and a half minutes, and you get 22 and a half minutes, and that's 45 minutes. And then actually, Karl, since you did choose to join us, if late, do you have any opening I'm waiting.
Yeah, I was going to. Have you been introduced?
Nah.
Okay, let me introduce him. Henry William Brands Jr., better known as Bill, grew up in Portland, Stanford, Reed College, Portland State, University of Texas. Finally got an education. He is the author of, catch this, he is the author of 41 books.
Whoa!
41. He's the original founder of the Book of the Year Club. So sign up and he'll guarantee you at least one. And he's written about Jackson, Grant, Theodore Roosevelt, FDR, Eisenhower, LBJ, Wilson, Reagan, Burr, Clayton, Calhoun, Webster, John Brown, Hamilton, Madison, Jefferson, John Adams, among others. One interesting fact about him that you don't know is that he is a member of a group, an elite group, with Lawrence Wright, who has been attending, and Stephen Harrigan, the novelist, and Greg Curtis, and they meet frequently for coffee and breakfast to decide the entire course of literature in the state of Texas. It's a secret cabal, much like the Illuminati, but he is one of the founding members.
Well, we tried to keep it secret, but then Karl found out. Occasionally he crashes.
Yeah, I stumbled in, but I don't get invited to the meetings any longer, so I don't know. Brinkley is originally from Atlanta, but grew up in a town you never heard of, which used to be politically very important, Perrysburg, Ohio, Lucas County. And he only went to 2 colleges. He was able to get out went to OSU, which has a football team, Georgetown, which used to have a basketball team, and he now teaches at Rice, which has neither. The other interesting thing is we all live within about 1.5 miles or 2 of each other in Austin, Texas. And in fact, the interesting fact about him is that he lives within about 100 yards of George P. Bush and Elon Musk. Or at least Elon Musk's baby mommy has a giant house with 8 bedrooms that's literally yards away from.
Yes.
So you have to give us some Elon Musk.
Yes. Okay.
And as they said, Brand is going to talk about the 1940 election. Doug is going to talk about the 1980 election. And at the end of this conversation, I will add a completely useless but intensely interesting comment about each of those 2 elections.
Good.
Okay.
The latest book that Bill has is the one that leads to the 1940 election, Roosevelt versus Lindbergh, in the Shadow of War.
Yes. Well, thank you. Thank you, Karl. And thank you, everybody, for coming on this Friday morning. I chose to talk about the 1940 election because, well, I've been writing about the 1940 election, which is in the middle of the book that I wrote, that Karl just mentioned, on the debate between Charles Lindbergh and Franklin Roosevelt on whether the United States should enter World War II. And the 1940 election was not precisely on that topic, but I'll explain what the connection is. The 1940 election was noteworthy for 2 issues primarily, two issues that were in the air. One was directly related to the election and directly engaged the nominees of the two parties. The other one was background, and it wasn't so distinctive between the two parties. The most important thing historically about the 1940 election was it was the first time that any two-term president seriously challenged the de facto George Washington ban on third terms. George Washington had been the first president of the United States. The Constitution of the United States at that time had no term limits on presidents. But George Washington left office after 2 terms, and it became a standard by which his subsequent presidents were effectively banned from seeking third terms. The thinking was that if 2 terms were enough for the father of our country, they ought to be enough for you. Now, after George Washington left office and after he died, he was often credited with wisdom and foresight in making this decision, and so making the presidency something different than it might have been otherwise, because there being no term limits, at the time being no term limits on the presidents, and as it turned out, and as we've discovered since, there is a big advantage in being an incumbent in running for re-election as compared to somebody who's challenging you. And so if Washington had not stepped aside after 2 terms, then we might have developed a presidency that looked sort of like the papacy, where you get elected. There's the College of Cardinals, we have our College of Electors. You get elected, but then you're expected to serve until God takes you away. And there was an irony here because George Washington actually died amid what would have been his 3rd term. So if he had accepted a 3rd term, assuming that he would have died under the same circumstances, our first president would have been a president for life. And because what Washington did became the standard for others, that might have been the system that we developed. But one of the things that isn't often appreciated about Washington's decision to step aside was it wasn't that he was thinking of what was best for his country. He wasn't thinking of those future ambitious presidents who would want to overstay their welcome. He had gotten sick and tired of politics and the sniping that was aimed even at him, George Washington, for heaven's sakes. People were criticizing him. And he thought, I didn't sign up for this. He wanted to quit after 1 term, but Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson said, both from opposite sides, they hated each other and each other's policies, and said, you can't quit, because then that other guy will get an edge. So he stuck around for a 2nd term, but he said 2 is enough and that's it. But nonetheless, that stuck. And it remained the norm, it remained the standard, inviolable, until 1940. And it was challenged by Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt managed to, I'll say, get away with this challenge because of the other thing that was going on in the world at the time. Europe went to war in the autumn of 1939. And Roosevelt used that first to delay making a decision on whether he would leave office, whether he would support a successor, what it would be. He could make the claim, plausibly, that I have to focus on the work, on leading the country. These are dangerous times. And so Roosevelt managed to essentially paralyze potential competitors within his own party. And he gave hints to various members of the party, if you play along, I'll throw my weight to you. And so along comes, so the war breaks out in September of 1939. We get to the end of 1939. The war is sort of on pause in Europe until it really breaks out in May of 1940. And then things blow up. And Roosevelt has additional reason not to say I'm leaving or not, because we need a firm hand at the tiller, until the election, the Democratic Convention is about to meet, and nobody has been able to mount any campaign. And so he arranges it so that the party has no choice but to draft him. And so he can present it to the world as though I didn't seek it. The office is seeking me. My country needs me. But anyway, it was a huge deal. And his Republican opponent, Wendell Willkie, made what you would expect to be the objections to this. Who do you think you are? Are you better than George Washington? This has been good enough for the United States for 150 years. Why do we have to change it now? And the Roosevelt side, they justified it in a slogan by saying, better a third-termer than a third-rater. So giving a slap to Wendell Willkie. So this was one of the big issues. And Americans understood in some way that this was a historic moment, precisely because it did open up the possibility of a big change in the nature of the presidency. However, most of them were willing to give Roosevelt a pass on this. Okay, there is this war going on, and your experience is perhaps going to be a good idea. Now, this is actually crucial to a historic understanding of Franklin Roosevelt. People didn't quite realize at the time, but Roosevelt did. If Roosevelt had left office after 2 terms, let's suppose there had been no war, then he would have had to leave office after 2 terms, and his reputation historically would have ranked him mediocre at best, because he had been elected to do one thing primarily: to end the Depression, to pull the United States out of misery and back into prosperity. And before the war began in Europe, that had not happened. And furthermore, if he had not run for re-election, no war, then he almost certainly, given the mediocre performance of his administration on this principal task, he would have been succeeded by a Republican. And that Republican would have had every incentive to dismantle as much of the New Deal as possible. Social Security was still in its infancy. The first payout check to a pensioner that Social Security paid was in 1940. People had been paying in for 5 years, and so it would have been vulnerable. But the war came, Roosevelt is able to run for re-election. He was supported by his own party, but many people said this is a really bad idea. And one of those people, perhaps the one who made the strongest case against it, was Charles Lindbergh. So my book is about the debate over whether the United States should enter World War II, and I focus on 2 protagonists, Franklin Roosevelt and Charles Lindbergh. And Lindbergh was not an elected official. He was not running for any office, but he became a spokesperson for the anti-war position, because he accused Franklin Roosevelt of maneuvering the United States toward war, even while saying he was trying to keep the United States out of war. And so one issue was Franklin Roosevelt, the 3rd term, the presidential tradition. The other issue, the one that was hanging over it all, was should the United States enter World War II? The reason that wasn't a central issue in the campaign itself was that Wendell Willkie, the Republican nominee, took a position not very far from Roosevelt's on, okay, we have to aid the British. By the time the election came around, France had already fallen, so that wasn't an issue. But we ought to keep the British fighting so that American soldiers don't. Toward the end of the campaign, Willkie came out more forcefully against Roosevelt on this, trying to distance himself, to the point where Roosevelt had been saying during the course of the campaign, I will not send American boys to fight in a war overseas unless American security is in danger. And those people who wanted more of an ironclad guarantee began to say, well, why the out clause at the end? And so in his last rally before the election, Roosevelt said, I will not send American boys to fight in any foreign wars, and left it at that. Now, this was one where his adult son, James, later called him out on this, because James had the advantage of knowing how things had turned out. And he said, Dad, how could you say that? You knew American boys were going to go fight. How could you say it even without qualification? And Roosevelt said, well, if I had left the door open to the possibility that I would send American boys to fight, then my enemies would have used it against me, and I would not have been elected. Now, I mean, this sounds like someone interested simply in the office, in winning. But Roosevelt, I'm convinced, had convinced himself that his leadership was necessary for the United States to survive this crisis, for the world, for democracy to survive this crisis. And so if all it required was a little fib about whether he was going to take the United States to war or not, he was willing to make the fib. Anyway, he won. The United States went to war. Charles Lindbergh and others who had said that if Roosevelt gets elected a third time, he'll get elected a fourth time, he'll probably be president for life. Well, indeed he was. He died in the presidency. I'll stop there. Go on to the next election.
Just to add one thing, you know, that 1936 election when he won big, FDR understood what you suggested, that if you're not a two-termer, first of all, nothing I did is going to matter.
Right.
And he won so large in 36, he decided that only thing that was ruining his greatness was the Supreme Court, because they were conservatives. And so there are 9, of course, justices. That's when he tried to pack the Supreme Court with 6. He didn't just dream it, he went for it to do 15. And in that moment in 37, he got undone on his plan by Southern Democrats that said that's an overreach of the Constitution. You just can't get a rubber stamp. We're not adding 7 young New Dealers to the Supreme Court. And he lost that badly. But the person he determined never to help again, John Nance Gardner of Uvalde, Texas, who had been his vice president for 2 terms. So if he didn't run in 40, the person he threw over was John Nance Gardner. Gardner, in the Washington tradition, as Bill says, thinking, I'm in. I've done my 2 terms as VP. It's my term now. But he didn't have enthusiasm for the court packing, and Roosevelt just let him wither. Late as the summer of 40, John Nance Gardner thought he was going to be the nominee, and he could not believe that when the news hit him that he was just being no role. Bye. That's what the hubris of Roosevelt. And then the picking, of course, of Henry Wallace and Truman, and then, as you say, the war kicking in, and Mr. Dr. New Deal, he says, is going to become Dr. Win the War. And Bill makes an interesting point. A 1-term FDR or even a 2-term FDR wouldn't be the FDR of rank 3rd among presidents.
One minor point about Roosevelt and the court packing, and then a question to Bill. He could hold a grudge. And there was a senator who had not come out openly against the court packing scheme, but whom he felt was undependable. So in 1940, Roosevelt, supports the governor of Missouri in a bid in the Democratic primary against the first-term incumbent, Harry S. Truman.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Truman beats the governor of Missouri, but never forgives the ad hoc chief of staff to Roosevelt. He can't blame Roosevelt for it, so he blames his chief of staff, a guy named James Rowe.
Yep.
And the story goes forward. Some of you may remember Truman has a famous memo given to him in 1947 by Clark Clifford that outlines how he's behind, he's going to lose unless he does a certain number of things. It's a brilliant memo. It understands the electorate. It proves to be the blueprint for the come-from-behind victory by Truman. And Clark Clifford lived off of that memo for the next 50 or 60 years. And he did not write the memo. The memo was written by James Rowe, who said to one of his colleagues, if I gave this to Truman, he was then still an official in the Office of the Budget, if I gave this to Truman, Truman would not listen to it. He would reject it because it came from me. So I looked around and I had a couple of copies and I gave one of them to that kiss-ass Clark Clifford because I know he was on his name and he listened to it. So anyway, that's your useless piece of information about that.
No, that's an important and fun story, and it hits at the key point I was just getting at. Roosevelt knew who double-crossed him, so even though that Supreme Court packing took place, he knew which Democrat abandoned him
to his last
dying day, because he did. And then Truman, he never liked FDR, and when he picked Truman to be the VP in 1944. He actually wanted William O. Douglas, the poker player, youngest Supreme Court justice from Washington State, 37 years old. Douglas was so progressive, New Dealer, was beyond kissing the ring. He was all in, but he put William O. Douglas and then Harry Truman on a card. So I get those are the two names to pick. And when it got to the Democratic Convention, where FDR didn't go, the team, Hannigan and others, forced Truman through because Douglas would have been wilder than FDR on New Deal policies, and Truman was more moderate. If he would have weighed in just a little stronger, not the two names said I wanted Douglas, there would have been no Harry Truman.
Yeah. Quick question to you, and then we'll turn to 1980. I'm intrigued in your book because there is this, I mean, the leading voice against Roosevelt is not the part of the Republican leadership.
Right.
It's not the Republican candidate, as you point out. And it's not just simply in 1940. The war begins in September. FDR goes to speak to the Congress on the 21st, and leading into that, Lindbergh is speaking on the radio against him, and then gives the principal response. It's not, we immediately go to the Republican, leader who's sitting there, Marco Rubio, grabbing for the bottle of water. They go to Lindbergh,
yeah,
who says, our bond with Europe is a bond of race and not of political ideology. If the white race is ever seriously threatened, it may then be time for us to take our part in it for its protection, to fight side by side with the English, French, and Germans. But do not with the support of the other for our mutual destruction. And then he writes a piece in the Reader's Digest the next month. We, the heirs of European culture of nations, are on the verge of a disastrous war, a war within our own family of nations, a war which will reduce the strengths and destroy the treasures of the white race. Now, do you think that might have, even in that day, had a grading edge on voters? He not to dwell on it, but he says there are powerful elements, a small minority who control much of the machinery of influence and propaganda. That's in May of 1940, and he's talking about the Jews.
And later he gets explicit. He says, and I'm speaking about Jewish Americans who do have this influence. So regarding Lindbergh's racialist thinking, first of all, this was the era of Jim Crow in the United States, so it was written into American law. And so I really don't know what the reaction of voters was to that. Lindbergh was a very odd spokesperson for this anti-war position. And he was odd because he was not a politician. He'd never run for or held political office. His father had been a member of Congress from Minnesota, but his father's experience cured him of any ambition to go there. And so he prided himself on being independent of politics and not having to tell people what they wanted to hear, the way politicians did. He also had the notions that you describe. I'm not sure how far out of the political mainstream they were then, but it was the sort of thing that was not spoken of in public. In fact, after he gave a speech, the one that really made him notorious, in which this is in the autumn of 1941, when the U.S. is really close to coming to war, and he identifies three groups primarily that want to see the United States involved in war. The first was the government of Britain, and he said that's perfectly understandable because Britain is at war and they want our help. The second group is Jewish Americans. It's perfectly understandable. Their relatives, families, and friends have been really put upon by the Nazis in Europe, and so it's understandable. And Lindbergh said, if the British position is understandable from their point of view, it should not dictate or guide American foreign policy. Jewish Americans are a minority in this country. They have a right to their view. Nonetheless, that shouldn't necessarily dictate policy. The third group, of which he was most critical, was the Roosevelt administration. And he said Roosevelt is lying us into this war for his own personal gain. And the newspapers the next day, they said nothing about Lindbergh's criticism of the British or Lindbergh's criticism of Roosevelt. It was all about Lindbergh bringing in what in those days was called the religious question into politics. And so at that point, Lindbergh was labeled this public anti-Semite. Now, one has to actually ask, what motivates this? He certainly has given his critics ammunition to use against him. But the people who were criticizing him were people who had political reason to do so. These were interventionists who were speaking about the principal anti-interventionist. But one of the results of this was that the anti-interventionist move it became known in history as the isolationist movement, which it didn't consider itself. But for the next 80 years, if you wanted to object to some American initiative in foreign policy, if you opposed American escalation in the Vietnam War, all somebody had to do was to call you an isolationist, and that would summon memories. Oh, you must have been like that Lindbergh guy. You were probably pro-Nazi and anti-Semitic. So if you were an isolationist, you weren't simply wrong, you were a bad person. And so that it's, in fact, so I cover the speech, this Des Moines speech, in my book, and I call it the most influential speech in American political history, but influential in exactly the opposite of the direction to which the speaker intended it.
The only thing I would add is that think about Henry Ford's anti-Semitism, and Henry Ford had objected to World War I, even brought the peace ship over. In 1927, Henry Ford, everybody talks about the Model T of 1908, first automobile, but it was the Model A in 1927 that boomed, and it coincided with paved roads, gas stations. Henry Ford was the Musk, or the Musk and Gates combined of the era, and he was publishing the Dearborn Independent and the Protocols of Zion, and Lindbergh worshipped Henry Ford, worshipped him, and at the same time Germany was worshiping Henry Ford, and Lindbergh and Ford for Nazi Germany were like the Americans they most wanted to meet, because they were dealing with the mechanical arts, cars, aviation, and they were superstars in Germany. And I think Lindbergh, for whatever his talents as aviator and adventurer, kept leaning to the Henry Ford's thinking this, it's about the bankers and New Yorkers that are ripping us. It was kind of a virulent Midwest populism, but it went all over Michigan and Wisconsin. And
Father Coughlin.
Father Coughlin in Detroit.
From Detroit.
I got to take issue with that. Yeah. So, because Lindbergh admired Ford as an inventor, and Lindbergh was a designer of aircraft. And so in his diary, when he talks about meeting with Henry Ford, he says, okay, we had this interesting talk. Ford has these crazy ideas. He tried to make me drink carrot juice when I was there. And so he understood that Ford was really out of his depth when he got out of the shop. And Lindbergh did not share the view that the bankers were all Jews and who had led the country into war. In fact, he married into a banking family. And so, it's one of the reasons that he was able to live the lifestyle that he lived. So Henry Ford was was a virulent anti-Semite, and he wore it on his sleeve and he published in his newspaper. The most you could say about Lindbergh was that he was somebody who said, okay, he was a sort of not in my country club anti-Semite. And that was about where it was, which, you can decide whether that's a distinction without a difference.
Yeah.
Brinkley, I asked for 2 minutes at the end.
No, okay. Oh, yeah, I want to give you more than two. Karl asked pick an election. I picked 1980, but I'll mention 1976 for a moment just because President Carter had just passed. And I hear for the first time the Democrats of today saying 1976, meaning should we run 50 states like Howard Dean wanted? Should we go to Iowa? Carter, banged on every door in Iowa. He came out of nowhere in '76 to get the nomination. And Carter won in October of 1975. Nobody would publish his memoir, Why Not the Best? Jimmy Carter, nobody. And a Broadman Press published it in Tennessee. He was unheard of. And then he sold 1 million copies. And then the Democrats kept putting anybody but Carter. This one-term governor can't make it. But Carter, through going to just door-to-door retail, hit New Hampshire, the Peanut Brigade. He knocked off heavyweights. He's getting rid of Mo Udalls and Frank Church, Jerry Brown, George Wallace, cornered out of it, Ted Kennedy. Incredible run Carter had to win. And that was a big deal because it kind of belied that notion that we love to quote over and over again when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Acts 64 and 65, there went the South. Well, they voted for Jimmy Carter in the South post 64 and 65. The South was about Carter due to cultural accent and Southern sensibility, the fact that he spoke openly about his born-again Christianity and his, and he had been a military man and he was down home. At any rate, when you cut to that inaugural, Carter was a leader of a new Democratic Party. And suddenly he pushed the Panama Canal that's in the news right now fast to give that canal back to the Panamanian people. Theodore Roosevelt, we used to say, we didn't steal the canal, we built the canal. And Carter wanted to have hemispheric goodwill and made that treaty agreement that's in the news so much. And he started losing a lot of those conservative Southern Democrats, Carter. I interviewed Senator Talmadge once at his little pond lake, and he's like, I was stuck with him as my, but the Panama Canal, he's killing us right out of the gate, doing the one, And Carter then just was besieged with issues. He did beat an incumbent, so it cancels the idea that incumbency is always good. In fact, Jerry Ford was the incumbent in '76. Carter beat him. The next year, Carter was the incumbent. Reagan beat him. And you look at what happened to Carter, he wasn't weak on the military. He wanted to raise it 5%, Reagan by 87%, but he seemed held hostage with the Iran, on foreign affairs with Iran-Contra. Carter didn't procure a Nobel for himself because a form wasn't filled out. When he negotiated with Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat, Carter's greatest moment as president, Camp David, Karl would probably even agree with that. And then he didn't his staff didn't do the paperwork to get Carter a Nobel. He would have joined Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt as a former president. Now he'll get one as ex-president for guinea worm disease and river blindness and good works around the world. And so it was he was fumbling around, and particularly the long gasoline lines, energy crisis. He didn't seem to get out of the hole. And he came in, I've never saw somebody say this on day one, Karl. This is not me kind of putting it tight. Carter actually said that days as the president, the Democratic Party is an albatross around my neck. He wanted, meaning the Scoop Jackson Democrats from the moderates and the Ted Kennedy liberals who he despised, Kennedys. And so he never really had a party. He was kind of a lone wolf kind of president that got accomplishes here and there, made Human Rights Anonymous recognize the People's Republic of China. We could do some things that Carter did successful, but he seemed weak against the Soviet Union. Russia, smelling weakness, invades Afghanistan, and then Carter boycotts the Olympics, and it's seen as he's punishing our athletes because they're supposed to be held in Moscow. Who's paying for all these young people who trained? Then he tried to rescue the hostages with helicopters, and his only real order was no bullets in the guns. He wanted rubber bullets because he wanted no blood on his hands. This is where his Christianity comes in. But Carter, they sent him, and he would later say, I needed a couple extra helicopters. It was a disastrous rescue mission. And then they couldn't get them out. So, the debates were Carter's big chance to get reelected. And they painted Ronald Reagan, or the Carter team, as a wild-eyed nuclear nut that will start pushing. You want him with the codes, the key, finger on the button. And that was the Carter's campaign. And it did track some. It kept Democrats saying, I'm going to hold my nose and vote for Carter. Except when the debates came. And Reagan outshined Carter in the debates using some adept use of one-liners, humor. And he didn't seem like a wild man that's going to blow up the world. And of course, Reagan wins a landslide election in 1980. Trump did not win a landslide. Yeah, 3 congressional seats in the Democrats are back in. Reagan really did. Only states that Carter held in 1980 against Reagan was Georgia, his home state, Minnesota, Walter Mondale, the vice president's home state, and Maryland. He lost Massachusetts to Reagan.
In a 3-way race.
In a 3-way race. Yeah. John Anderson in 1980 ran as a moderate, unusual bird Republican from Illinois, but an outlet for certain people. I know Arthur Schlesinger Jr., the great Kennedy Democrat, voted for Johnson because he, because he would not vote for Carter. Yeah. So Reagan came in with a true mandate. You're looking at a changing sphere, and in 1980, Reagan not only won decisively, but he gave the inaugural talking about best government might be less government. He didn't mean that permanently, but he meant at this moment in history, government's got too big. And he was polarized to a degree. Even though he won a landslide, the people that despised Reagan, liberals that could not stand him like people that can't stand Trump right now, they getting shot changed things somewhat because Reagan, of course, got the bullet and he said, I forgot to duck, and they raced him to George Washington Hospital. In his diaries, he writes, I woke up and I thought I had died. And he starts in his diaries saying, I'm going to now serve God. So I never thought of Reagan as a religious president, and Nancy Reagan dealt with astrology and things. I mean, and dabbled in some things, but he keeps feeling that one of his goals is to reduce nuclear weapons from the world. And yet, that's the private Reagan. The public Reagan continues as SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, Iron Dome, across the United States in today's parlance. And Reagan is determined to win the Cold War, doesn't pull back the rhetoric. The thing about Reagan, he was seen as far right in his radio addresses of the 1960s. Listen, you can read them. By 1980s or 90s, what he had said in the 60s was accurate. He was the leader, Reagan, who understood the real nature of Russia and that democracy was going to win, and he didn't hedge any of his bets on it. And by the time of '84, when he had to run for re-election, it was going to be tighter because in the realm of U.S. foreign policy, in January of 1984, he had an average of polls, and Carl's the master of polls, like a 27% approval rating in foreign policy, Reagan, when he's running for re-election. He turns that number completely around when he goes to Europe and does the Peggy Noonan speech about D-Day and the boys appoint to Hock and Utah and all of that, because it wasn't just the way Reagan delivered it with that backdrop. It was an opening to tell any American, we love you if you served our country. My dad served in the Korean War, and he turned Reagan was talking about our war, and then USA Today particularly, but everybody started saying, is there a veteran? Did anybody serve in a war here? And people would stand up in little towns. And he won over the Truman Democrats, Reagan, and Social Security Democrats, and people that put patriotic value, the flag, what we did before, because he was kind of skipping over Vietnam. He's going back to World War II and Korea and the greatness of America. And so he was able to beat decisively Mondale. And again, the debates helped Reagan, but he was much more infirmed. That bullets that he took really weakened his body. I mean, people don't know, but it drained him. And at Sunnylands last night, I saw a great picture of Reagan in pajamas watching Gorbachev on TV. And it's the end, some of the domestic issues, it was all about the economy for Reagan, but it was also a foreign policy moment that he's always wanted to win the Cold War. And by the time he left and George Herbert Walker Bush came in, the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. And in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. And it becomes a cause and effect tilted towards Reagan. And he had cheerleaders on his legacy, big ones like Margaret Thatcher saying he won the war without firing, Cold War without firing a single shot. He had Pope John Paul II. He had Chancellor Kohl. He had embraced Havel and Polish solidarity with Lech Walesa. The movement of history was culminating, and Reagan has become a beneficiary of that. And it started with a bang and ended with a bang, yet sick. Here in California, in his diaries, people say, did he have dementia or Alzheimer's at the end, Reagan? There are passages. One, he said, I can't believe I'm flying over my favorite place and I can't think of the name of it. And it's driving me crazy. My mind's never did that. He's writing that. Then he goes, Topanga Canyon. He was flying over it, but his mind went. It's like, my God, why can't I think? And then he said, I don't know what's going on. I'm putting my eardrops in my eyes. This is at the very end of his presidency. But he's starting to notice things of slippage, mistakes, but he's cognizant enough of them that he's marking them down as an aberration. But when he leaves, of course, he has to confront, after doing some speeches, Alzheimer's. And Nancy Reagan did a nice job of keeping him, caretaking and keeping him away from paparazzi that would take, belittling photographs.
You wrote a book about Reagan, Bill.
I did.
Do you have any observations about the 1980 election?
I'm struck at the importance in that election. Elections reflect lots of things, the state of the world, the state of the economy, but personality, persona, character, the way candidates carry themselves really makes a lot of difference. And Jimmy Carter knew a lot about being president. He knew more detail about more stuff that presidents benefit from knowing than Ronald Reagan did. But Ronald Reagan understood how to perform the presidency, how to act presidential, how to make people feel that this is a leader. Jimmy Carter never got that message across. And so when the two were seen side by side, Reagan simply looked more presidential. And at a moment when Carter had various things hanging around his neck, the hostages in Tehran, and the revolution in Central America and the state of the economy and all this stuff, Reagan the surprising thing about the 1980 election, as you point out, is how decisively Reagan won. I think he would have won anyway, but he really understood how to play that role, and he did through his entire presidency. Some of it had to do with his sense of humor, his ability to tell a joke. Did Jimmy Carter ever tell a joke in a political situation? No. And for Reagan, it worked magic, because it was always a slightly self-deprecating joke, and people would chuckle. And Reagan understood if you get people to laugh with you, you're halfway to getting them to agree with you. People didn't like Reagan's policies, but nobody really didn't like Reagan himself. You couldn't work up animus against Reagan personally, and that served him very well.
We forget there were two debates in 1980, but Carter appeared in only one.
Yes.
The first debate was between John Anderson and Reagan, and Carter didn't want to give visibility to Reagan or the credibility of being a presidential candidate, so he didn't show up. So ironically enough, the debate was a total disaster for Carter, because one, it made John Anderson look like he was the left-winger and Reagan was the reasonable sort of moderate conservative. And second of all, Reagan spent most of the debate talking about his experience as what? The governor of the most populous state in the Union, and back then California had a slightly better reputation than today. And catch this, 60 million people watched that debate. That is, more people watched the debate between Anderson and Reagan when our country was in 1980 and much smaller than watched the debate in June between Biden and Trump.
Yeah.
And then, so when they got into the debate, Bill is absolutely right. Remember the famous line? Carter said, I've been talking to my daughter Amy about nuclear disarmament. And there's Reagan, who knows that it's performance, saying, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? And he continually talked about being governor of California. So here's, as Doug said, They're pushing, he's a right-wing lunatic, and here's the guy talking about being the governor of the biggest state in the union. And so there was disconsonance there. All right, two quickly, and then we will dismiss you from class, and there will be a quiz afterwards. The interesting piece of information about 1980. What were the battleground states in 1980? Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. You remember those. How about Florida and Ohio, which used to be battleground states and no longer? Mm-hmm. But you know what the other battleground states were? Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. Carter begins his re-election campaign with an appearance in Tuscumbia, Alabama. And I'm the 20-some-odd-year-old executive director of the Texas Reagan-Bush Victory Committee. We had voted for a Republican president in an open race for the presidency in 1928. And we were a Democrat state. We'd elected a Republican governor after a mere 114-year absence of Republican state elected officials. And we had 16 Republicans out of 150 in the Texas House when I moved there 3 years before that election. So Texas was a battleground state. Now here's the weird one about 1940. We passed over Wendell Willkie. Wendell Willkie is the Republican nominee, and he should not have been. He is a registered Democrat until February of 1940.
Yeah.
He was the head of the Commonwealth Southern. He had bested Roosevelt's Attorney General in a famous radio debate series. He caught the attention of a guy named Samuel Pryor, Jr. Sam Pryor was born in Missouri. His dad moved east to take over Remington Arms that furnished most of the bullets for World War I. And he grew up wealthy and became a wealthy investor and became the young Republican National Committee man at the age of 38 in Connecticut. And he knew everybody. And he fell in love with Willkie, invites Willkie in 1938 to speak at the 150th anniversary of the Greenwich Episcopal Church. And he does a spectacular job, and so he begins introducing him. He introduces him to the governor of Connecticut, the governor of Colorado, other Republican officials around the country, begins boosting him for the nomination in 1940, where the front runners are Robert Taft of Ohio, Dewey of New York, the famous prosecutor who nearly became governor of New York in 1938, and Arthur Vandenberg, the senior Republican senator from Michigan, all of whom are well-known lifelong Republicans, and the upstart is backed by people who support the U.S. involvement in supporting the Brits. At Pryor is the number 2 on the Credentials Committee, or excuse me, the Arrangements Committee, and the chairman of the committee is a fervent opponent of Willkie, who dies of a heart attack presiding over the committee meeting. Pryor becomes the head of the Credentials Committee, and he and the chairman of the convention, John Hamilton, arrange a strategy to take the grassroots support for Willkie and help him become the nominee. They do things like they line up delegates and say, okay, vote for this guy on the first ballot, and on the second or third ballot, we're going to tell you when. You're going to swing in behind Willkie to show that he's gaining support on every ballot. And they play it adroitly. They find every enemy of Dewey and gin him up. They find every opponent of Vandenberg in Michigan. They gin him up. It is a brilliantly executed convention, and Willkie becomes the nominee, and Pryor is the prime mover in all of this. Now, what does this have to do with Bill's book?
I need to write another chapter.
No, better. Pryor.
Karl,
Yes.
you were late arriving, but you can't stay late at the end.
All right. Let me finish. 30 seconds. Pryor is the head of an aircraft, is on the board of an aircraft company, an airline, and makes a friend with Charles Lindbergh. And in 1968, takes him to his estate in Hawaii, and Lindbergh falls in love with Maui, and he sells him at a special price, 4 acres next to him. Lindbergh builds a place there. It becomes his favorite place on the face of the planet. And when he is dying of cancer in a New York hospital, Sam Pryor Jr. arranges for him to be smuggled aboard a United Airlines flight with a doctor crew to take him to Hawaii so that he can die at his place in Maui. And today, in a graveyard in Hana, lies the body of Charles Lindbergh, and right next to him is his friend, Sam Pryor Jr.
Wow.